call today's guest a curator of culture. Bobby Green is one of the owners of the 1933 group, known for taking classic buildings and bringing them back to life with new and exciting concepts. They've always been about elevating the cocktail and dining experience. With some of LA's oldest establishments, including Harlowe, Formosa Cafe, and even the recently reopened Tale of the Pup, we do a deep dive into the rich history that makes up so much of West Hollywood. Bobby?
Yes.
Hi,
Hello.
welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I'm actually excited about this conversation because I'm a fan of a lot of the places that you own, with how you've been able to bring to life these historic venues and bring them to new life and keep them relevant, especially in today's day and age. I mean, that's where I see the curator of culture element.
Yeah, especially for West Hollywood, which has such an interesting and storied kind of past.
Yes.
And especially with some of the places that obviously you guys are part of. But
Yes.
but the history of West Hollywood, I think, makes holding on to it even more interesting. So.
Yeah.
For sure.
So why don't we go ahead and start at the beginning? So how did you get here? So how did everything come about? How did 1933 group form?
So first I'll answer how I got here.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, please.
Which is a kind of funny story. So I landed in Los Angeles at the age of 10.
Okay.
This is 1980.
Okay.
Which is a great year for LA.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was the typical migrate to LA story. You know, the child actor, the mother, who wanted her kids to,
Wow.
get an agent. The typical story.
Oh my gosh.
You always hear, right?
I love this.
Because we came from Oklahoma, and in Oklahoma I was doing maybe started out in the church choir, and then it goes on to acting classes, and then you perform at the theater, and the typical story. And so from the age of 10 until 18, I was forced to.
That's the authenticity of West Hollywood right there.
Keep it real.
I was forced into the acting world, which I think I liked as a young kid, but I really started hating it once I became a teenager, because you're in junior high and then you're in high school and your friends are out skating and your friend's got a mohawk and he dyes it green and you can't do that because you gotta be the perfect, little boy for commercials.
You have to look like that headshot.
Yeah, exactly. You gotta look like your headshot. So I started really disliking it, but I was still doing it because I kind of had to, living at home.
Yeah.
Right. And then the last thing I did, I had right before I turned 18, was Scrooged, the Bill Murray movie.
Wow.
Yeah, I was one of the carolers
gosh,
in his
I love
show.
this.
And then I turned 18, weeks after filming that, quit acting and moved out of the house.
Wow.
Yeah,
You're like, I'm done.
Done. Totally done. I thought it was the most boring, stressful thing, as a kid. Of course, it's funny. Ironically, I'm on TV and things, like this more now than I ever did back then.
You're
but
playing yourself.
yeah,
So it's different.
it's on my terms.
It is. That too.
Exactly. So got out of that. And then I just started working in hospitality, working in coffee houses. But I also grew up with an art design background.
Oh, neat.
My dad was an artist. My grandmother was a designer. And so to me, I wanted a career in art and design because that's the only thing I really ever excelled at.
Yeah.
And I was going to go to Art Center, and I was working in coffee houses throughout my teens and then into my early 20s. And I got fired from every job I ever had because I think I was just born. I had to work for myself.
Yeah.
I hated authority figures. I always thought I could do better than everybody else. And so I'd get fired and go on to the next coffee house or whatever. And then I got a call one day in my early 20s from a guy who actually fired me from this little coffee house in West LA. And he said, "Hey, I'm going to sell the place. And you and your friends always said you could do a better job than me. So maybe you want to buy me out." So
Love this.
So great.
Yeah, it's so great. And so I ended up selling this Nash Metropolitan that I had. And our friends, me and a couple guys, pulled our money together and we bought the coffee house. It was called Cacao.
Okay.
And first thing we did, remodel it. We made it like a tiki sci-fi themed coffee house. Because
this is so fun.
Because I was, in my late teens, early 20s, I was haunting all the cool old school places of LA, the Formosa being one of them.
Yeah.
Especially the Formosa because back in the late 80s, they didn't card anybody.
Yeah.
So you'd go in there and it's like full of like 19-year-olds.
That was a spot.
Yeah. When you were that young, you knew every place that you could go get a drink.
Of course.
Formosa was one of them. And so I was, and growing up in LA, I loved vintage. Like one of the first things I saw coming to LA was like a pink Cadillac or a 57 Chevy. And remember the 1980s, there was kind of like a 50s, 80s revival in LA. There was diners and cars everywhere. And so I got really into vintage cars from when I was 15 years old. My first car was a 57 Chevy.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. It was just so LA to me,
Totally.
and we had the room and we had the streets and you could cruise, all day long in your old car. Oh. And it was just like a dream. I just loved it. And I'm still a super avid car person. And so that got me into the car was the gateway drug to the world of vintage, because
I love that.
You drive in the old car, and then you start listening to the music of the time, and then you start buying clothes of the time. Then you start finding architecture, so you can take a picture of your car in front of it, so it's like a time travel photo. And so it's just snowballs. And so the places I would love as a young scenester, I guess you'd call it, were like the Dresden Room and the Formosa and the Ski Room and Musso Frank's. Like kind of seeking out that time travel LA experience. So I already had a love. And Tail the Pup, speaking of which, was one of my first memories of LA. Like
really,
before we even moved here, we would come here like for a few months in the summer, right?
Yeah.
And then go back to Oklahoma and come back. And I remember after the first trip to LA, going back to Oklahoma and remembering the Hollywood sign and Tail the Pup.
Those are your two
like
first
the
memories.
icon, like these two icons of LA.
It's amazing.
Yeah, and so that place was always ingrained into my memory. To me, that was LA.
Yeah.
So that's how I got here.
Yeah, I love that.
And that's how I got into hospitality, running this little coffee house, which I did for 6 years. And that became, so I basically skipped college and just did that. So I got a head start. That became my college. I learned about how to run a little cafe. And during that whole process, I loved it because I was meeting people, having art shows, having live music, and getting to know like all the young artists and students of LA. And so I was going out to bars. Yeah. So suddenly I want to open a bar. It's like, I love this, but I want to do something bigger. I want to open a bar. And it had to be thematic because to me, that was always the coolest restaurants were thematic.
Of course.
Yeah. Even growing up.
Yeah.
The coolest restaurants were
And when
thematic.
they're well done, it's not kitschy, and it also almost helps like transport people to another time, era. It adds to the whole experience.
100%.
Yeah.
And transport's a word I use a lot, actually. So I came up with the concept of the Bigfoot Lodge. It would be a log cabin bar that felt like you were in the mountains of Colorado or in Yellowstone. Yeah. Something like reminded me of the places I used to go to as a kid. I was also a big fan at that time. This is like, we're talking 1987, 88 of Twin Peaks.
Okay. Yeah.
And I love that aesthetic and that vibe. And so for about 3 years, I asked every person I'd meet, hey, I want to open a bar. Do you want to invest? Do you want to invest? Do you want to invest? Because I didn't have the money to do it. Of course. So I just had the dream. And after 3 years of asking hundreds of people, I finally connect with the partners I have now. It was like a friend of a friend of a friend. Yeah. And it was these two guys my age, exact age. So we were 22 years old.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
They had just opened a clothing company about a year prior. And my friend said, hey, you should meet Bobby. He like knows everybody and he wants to open a bar and I think it's going to be really successful. And so we met and the rest was history. They said, okay, let's do it.
So you've and then ended up basically creating all of these. You've had this history of finding these sort of like historic buildings and then bringing them to life. And 3 in particular happen to be in West Hollywood.
Yes.
So we've got Harlowe, Formosa Cafe, as well as Till the Pup, which, by the way, love that you're representing.
I'm wearing the shirt with all the logos on it.
Exactly.
Yeah. But it's funny because those are all places I frequented my life growing up in LA.
That's so cool. Comes full circle.
Full circle. The Harlowe was the Crown Bar. Before that, it was like, I think it was called Blue something. But I used to go to like a little ska rock steady dance night there years ago. And then when it became Crown Bar, it was like a super paparazzi kind of celebrity driven club, you know? And of course the Formosa I'd go to, you know, in the late 80s and through the 90s. And it was a scene. It was a huge scene there.
Yeah.
Tons of celebrity, the young Hollywood celebrity set was always hanging out there. We just got a bunch of photos from a photographer back at that time.
Oh,
and
really?
It was like Charlize Theron and David Grohl.
Oh, yeah.
And the cast of Friends. And, you know, I remember seeing River Phoenix there.
Oh,
I
wow.
remember seeing...
this is at the Formosa?
This was at the Formosa.
Yeah, Formosa.
Because, you know, Formosa, when it opened in 1939, was directly across from the studios.
Yep.
You know, and so celebrities would just walk across the street because it was a place to get a cocktail and
easy,
you know, drink
after
between
hours.
takes and all that. And so every celebrity you could think of hung out there, and it just became kind of like a safe haven for celebrities. And it still is till today. And it even was when I was in my 20s.
You know, considering your background, you've also taken more of a thoughtful approach to like the cocktail experience. And I think that this was also really interesting. So it wasn't just, you know, each of these businesses weren't necessarily just historic places. How could one even say just? I mean, obviously that's the incredible part of it. But then you took it to the next step. And you really wanted to sort of focus on more of like the mixology element of it. Is that right?
Sure, food and cocktails.
Yeah, food and cocktails.
Yeah, because you have to keep up with the trends of the times, of course, you know. Because when I got into the bar business, I call it the Skittles era.
Yeah.
It was like all your cocktail had to be was like the color of a Skittles and taste
true.
be super sweet. And people were drinking them like, you know, like fish.
Skittles, I love that.
But you know, at some point, a decade or more ago, that shift started to change to, you know, the way the food had changed over the years, you know, fresher ingredients, more complicated cocktails, which really isn't, I mean, it kind of goes in waves. Like if you look at the old tiki bar culture of the 40s and 50s, those were elaborate, complicated drinks, you know, that had fresh mint, and then they had muddled cherries, and it had a lot of interesting ingredients. But then we kind of got away from that and went to these cheap, you know, the cosmopolitan days.
Exactly.
But now we're kind of back, and even way more than it ever was with the craft of making a cocktail.
Completely.
And I think we're actually kind of swinging out of it, to be honest with you.
Really?
Yeah, because it got too fussy. You know,
a 10-minute cocktail.
Well, that was the biggest problem. The time.
Yeah, volume.
The time.
I mean, you can't keep up with the pace if you have a lot of people there.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And sadly, that trend, you know, because it's all around the world.
Yeah.
But the trend kind of got away from like what people really, really want at a bar. They want a friendly bartender, and they want to drink fast.
Yes.
This
is true.
Yeah. So we're kind of getting back to the roots of like somewhere like a happy medium.
Yeah.
I think like let's have a great cocktail, but not take half an hour.
Yeah.
And maybe smile.
Maybe.
When I walk up to the bar. And so that's where we're at now. And that's where I like it to be.
No,
I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, when I first got this job in marketing for Visit West Hollywood, I did a whole photo shoot, and I had people like sitting at a bar or sitting out by the pool with glasses of wine or champagne. And I got a lot of criticism for it because it was like, oh, we're not really a wine place. We're more of a craft cocktail place. And I thought that was really like, it was one of my first learnings. It was like, okay, if we do a shoot, we have to do it, you know, with a craft cocktail. So I think it's interesting that it's swinging back a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't know if to wine necessarily. Obviously, wine is classic and will always be, but it's interesting that it's kind of getting to be a more real kind of thing, I guess.
Yeah.
Right.
It needs to swing back and then just stay there. Let's just, let's give people what they really want and make people happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. So why don't we talk about the different properties that are here and just you can break down the concept. So starting with Harlowe, I know you kind of touched on that a bit.
Every place we do prior to, let's say, the restorations of the historical places, I mean, we would pretty much just completely gut the place.
Yeah.
And start from scratch because there was very, very many elements that were worth keeping at the time. Obviously, the historical places are a completely different story.
Of course.
Harlowe wasn't. Harlowe had changed concepts many times.
So many times, yeah.
And it kind of showed. There's like layers that get put on restaurants and bars over the years. And so what I like to do is I like to just strip all the layers back to the building itself, like what it looked like back when it was first built.
Yeah.
So we strip it all back and then we just kind of add a little bit to what we find, and that becomes the finished product. It just had a feeling of like classic Hollywood.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of took it down that path of classic Hollywood.
It has such a cool vibe to it. So speaking of classic Hollywood, let's talk about Formosa Cafe.
That's real classic Hollywood.
Real, like historic, iconic. If people don't know it, they probably know it. They've probably seen the image of it, you know.
They've seen it in a movie
100%.
or heard a story about it.
You've said, or at least one of your partners have said, that it was probably one of the hardest acquisitions to get. Is that right?
It was.
Talk us through that.
Well, it's an interesting story of how it became a difficult thing to get because the Formosa had been threatened with demolishing probably 2 different times over its lifetime. The first was the Warner Studios across the street. At that time they owned the land. This was in like late 70s, 80s. And they wanted to expand the studio and they wanted to make that a parking lot. And
oh my gosh.
It was one of those times where I don't think you see enough anymore, where patrons come out, organize, call the news, and they picket for like days.
Yeah.
It's like save the Formosa.
Yeah.
We have some great photography of news articles around that time.
Oh, wow.
And so they did. They ended up saving the Formosa because Warner Studios like didn't want the bad press anymore.
Wow.
They were getting a lot of bad press over it. And so they finally said, okay, we're calling it off.
Yeah.
We're going to do it. So it was saved once, right? Then again, it was threatened with the mall development next door. And this was in the late 90s.
Okay.
Again, people protested, save the Formosa. They picketed again. And over the years, slowly, the Formosa kind of ran its course a bit, like some places do. And it was not being run so well, I'll put it that way. And finally, at some point, several years back, someone came in and decided just to take all the historical stuff out. They're like, let's just get all this old stuff out of here. Let's just paint the walls gray, make it feel more modern. But very poor decision, obviously.
I think I remember that.
Yeah, you do, because the press and the public just immediately outlashed.
Yeah, of course.
Like the second it opened, immediate outlash. Because of the protests of the late 90s, the developers knew the right person had to be the new caretakers.
Of course.
Couldn't just be any old person. And so we ended up kind of not whining and dining, but we ended up courting the powers that be.
Yeah.
And luckily we already had 2 really large restoration projects in our belt. We invited them to come down. We toured them on both locations. And I even had friends from the LA Conservancy, the Hollywood Heritage Museum, write letters of support for us. Because really at the time, there was no one else in town that could say, well, look what I've saved, look what I've saved.
Exactly. We're proof of concept. Like, this is what we've done before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Proof that we really care and we get it. And so that they were won over at that point, and they said, "Yeah, you guys really are the best people to do this."
It's so cool. I mean, again, like with each of these buildings and these concepts, it's so cool how it's like bringing to life this history. So, okay, got to talk about Tale of the Pup. Bring us full circle with that. For those that may not be aware of Tale of the Pup, how was it? I mean, you mentioned it that was one of your first memories
Yes.
of LA when you were a kid.
It was.
Could you describe it? Because I think the visual description of it is really interesting.
Yeah, well, we could go really deep with it and go back even further. There's a trend in architecture called programmatic architecture.
Okay.
And it evolved because of the creation of the automobile.
Oh.
So before the 1920s, most people were walking or riding a horse,
Yeah.
right? So if you had a business, you would just hang a sign.
Yeah.
Everybody would see you. Well, once the Model T, then the Model A came out, people were driving by your business suddenly. And so people were like,
How do we get
no
their
one
attention?
can see my sign.
Yeah.
I'm a shoe store. I'm just going to build a giant shoe. So you can
That's what
see it.
that is.
That's
so you
what that
see
is.
that. So we all know in a lot of different cities, but I mean, I know it was certainly really popular here. That,
Well, LA was the king
Yes.
of programmatic architecture because we were a young city. We weren't built up in the 20s, 30s, 40s. We weren't built up like every major city
Yeah.
in America. So we had land, we had space, we could build whatever we wanted, and we had a city full of dreamers and movie industry people. So it was just natural
Yeah.
to, let's like the Brown Derby. Let's make a giant
Yes,
hat.
exactly.
And it's a
I was thinking
restaurant.
of
There was hundreds. That first place we restored in North Hollywood, the Idle Hour, is programmatic architecture. It's a giant barrel.
Yes.
Wooden barrel.
very familiar.
And so Tale of the Pup was one of the few surviving examples. Sadly, the trend became very passé,
Yeah.
starting in about the 60s. So 60s, 70s, 80s, they were just being torn down. And a lot of them were made out of plaster and chicken wire. So, it didn't last all that long. But the Tale of the Pup did. And it thrived because it never closed. It was always open. So they were always fixing it, repainting it,
Yeah.
keeping the building alive. But the building was kind of one of the later programmatic architecture buildings to be built. It was designed before World War II, 1938, 39. But because the war started, they put the construction on hold.
Yeah.
And then right after the war, so 1946, they built it and opened it.
Yeah.
And it was a famous celebrity dance couple, Yolanda and Velez.
Oh.
And they were a ballroom dancing like celebrities.
Okay.
And they opened it because they wanted to have kids.
Yeah.
And that kind of ended their career as ballroom dancers for several years. So they opened this giant hot dog instead to have a business going.
that.
The natural
Progression.
progression.
You go
right?
from ballroom dancing
dancers
to selling hot
Yeah,
dogs.
to selling hot
That's
dogs.
so funny.
I mean,
Yeah. But they hired, there was an architect, Milton Black, who was a fairly well-known architect in the 30s. He was a deco meets streamlined modern
Yeah.
in Los Angeles. And they hired him to design. So it's basically a giant hot dog. It's 19 feet long. It's about 10 feet tall. And then the side of it opens up, and
Yeah.
that's your window. And that was built La Cienega and Beverly, 1946. And it opened like a movie premiere. There were searchlights.
Really?
There were paparazzi.
Oh, that's cool.
All their celebrity friends
Everybody was ready
came.
for the hot dogs. Like,
Yeah.
I love it.
It was a huge opening. And it just thrived as, but to me, a mascot of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So I had some friends, some preservation friends, including Allison Martino, who actually lives next
Yeah.
door here, looking for it. And she ended up finding it. She found the family.
Where was it?
It was in a storage warehouse in Torrance.
Oh my gosh.
And so she ended up meeting with the family, kind of doing filming
Yeah.
and visiting with the pup. And the kids ended up inheriting it, but they didn't want to, they didn't want to run it.
Yeah.
They were looking for something to do. So they were trying to find a developer or somebody to take it over. They talked with Caruso. They talked with, I think, even Westfield Mall. But none of the deals ever worked out.
Yeah.
And sadly, they were tired of holding on to it for all these years. And so what they did was they donated it to the Valley Relics Museum. And my friend Tommy runs the museum.
Yeah.
And basically, he collects all these really cool things about LA, whether it's an old sign or an icon of LA that has been torn down or is out of business. So he just collects it all. And he created a great museum. And so, to his credit, they bring him the hot dog, and they kind of convey to him how bummed they are that it's not going to be a hot dog stand ever again. And so Tommy said, well, if I knew someone that could reopen it, would you give it to them instead?
Yeah.
And they said, yeah, we would. So Tommy called me, and he said, hey, you know, tell the pup. I'm like, of course. He's like, I want you to meet the kids, and you guys can work something out.
That's so cool.
And I was super excited.
Yeah, of course. It's so fun. And of course, your personal ties to it as well.
Well, that's the greatest thing about all these places is my childhood memories or my teenage 20s memories.
Yeah.
And I get to come back and like save
in
a physical incarnation my memories.
Yeah, of course.
Which are also the city's memories, of course.
Absolutely.
But it's super rewarding.
What year was that you met with the curator of the museum and he said, now the family will do it if you open a business?
That was 2018.
18?
Yeah, not too long ago, right?
That was 2018. Now here, I have to tell the story because this is a West Hollywood story. And this is why West Hollywood is different than the rest of LA.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, but definitely share.
So I'm in the middle of restoration of the Formosa, and we were able to acquire the Tail of the Pup, 2018. And a press came out about it. 1933 group acquires Tail of the Pup.
Yeah.
Plan to reopen. And so the acting mayor and city planner of West Hollywood at the time saw the articles in the paper and found me and contacted me. And they didn't even know about Formosa at the time.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
And they contacted me. They say, hey, we heard about the Formosa. We would love to meet with you and talk to you about it. I said, great, sure. Come down. I'm restoring the Formosa right now. And they're like, are you serious? I was like, yeah. And I said, come down. Let's talk about it. So they came down. This was Paul Aravello and John D'Amico. And they came down and they said, we would love to do whatever we can to keep Tail of the Pup in West Hollywood.
Oh.
And what city does that?
Yeah.
That is unheard of in Los Angeles. And so I was so touched by that. And, I could tell that the pup meant as much to them as it did to me.
Yeah.
And so I was pretty adamant about keeping it in West Hollywood because it was born here.
Yeah,
it
makes
lived
sense.
its entire life here. And, West Hollywood encourages interesting things.
Of course.
And that's what sets it so apart. So the pup being one of the most interesting things in all of LA. When we met with the broker and to get the tour of the building, I learned that it was the Doors recording studio.
No way.
Yes, it was their office and recording studio. 1970, they recorded LA Woman there upstairs.
Oh, that is so cool.
And then downstairs, the little bathroom downstairs was Jim Morrison's vocal room. So that's where he would sing because the acoustics were really good.
Like where else in the world? Like really only in West Hollywood, honestly.
It's such an amazing thing.
He lived, I think he lived in apartments probably
right next door.
Right next door.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then his girlfriend owned a little clothing store just right around the corner on La Cienega at the time. So I think he was walking around here all the time.
Oh, yeah.
And we have a picture of him eating a hot dog on a sidewalk.
Of course.
And I'm pretty sure that's the Tail of the Pup. Because all he had to do was walk down La Cienega.
Probably. How would you kind of describe the scene or the vibe in West Hollywood? You've got businesses in various parts of the city, but how would you say that West Hollywood is different and how have you seen that maybe influence some of your businesses that are specifically here?
Well, to me, West Hollywood is actually like this last holdout of what Hollywood was.
Yeah.
What it became, what it started as.
Yeah.
Because coming here as a kid, in 1980, there was still a lot of the Hollywood that was built from the 20s to the 80s around me.
Yeah.
And over the years growing up, you see it slowly disappearing. And you realize, Hollywood started out as a crazy vision by a bunch of interesting people.
Yeah.
We had that kind of can-do, let's do something bigger, crazier than anywhere else in the country. That style of architecture just being one of the things, but the studios and the Hollywood sign and the Walk of Fame and all those things are just so different than anywhere else in the world.
It's true.
And we were okay with being loud and flashy and quirky and fun. And that was what Los Angeles was about. And then it slowly started disappearing. But I feel like West Hollywood has always saved it. Like
totally.
They encourage it.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what makes West Hollywood way more fun than most of Los Angeles.
Yeah. For those that might be coming to West Hollywood, would love to hear, how would you describe your ideal day, night out? In your ideal West Hollywood experience, what would that be for somebody that was coming here maybe for the first time? Where should they eat? What should they do? Where should they stay? I want to hear from you. And it's okay. We all have favorites.
Well, because I'm such a vintage nut.
Of course. You're not the only one.
That, usually when people ask me where they stay, they're usually someone kind of like me that wants kind of that old Hollywood experience,
Yeah.
And so I've had friends stay, obviously, Chateau Marmont, but also the Sunset Marquis.
Yeah, Sunset Marquis is amazing.
Yeah, and once they stay there and they see there's
music
Joan
history,
Jett and there's there's Led Zeppelin passed out on the pool, and you see like it's like Tale of the Pup. As soon as you start seeing all these photographs, you're like, oh my gosh, this was like a really
Connecting the
cool
dots.
time in Los Angeles. My friend Mike Wolf, who has that show American Pickers.
Yeah.
That's the only place he'll ever stay is the Sunset Marquis.
I mean, it's such a cool historic place.
And I feel like, you have to rent a convertible.
Yes.
You just have to.
Yes, the sun is out again.
You gotta rent a convertible. You have to do the drive. Obviously, you could drive around Beverly Hills. Okay, see some big houses. But I always tell people, you got to do that drive down Sunset Strip.
The Sunset Strip
and
is
just
classic.
go all the way to the beach.
Yeah.
And come back. It's such a beautiful
And it's
drive.
cool because you do, and we've spoken about this before, but, the Sunset Strip is specifically here in this part of West Hollywood. But again, the history, just in that part of the boulevard, obviously, then you can see it as it expands across the city. But it is so cool because it's so iconic.
It's
We all
super
know it.
iconic. Yeah. And, if you're an art design person from another city, visit the Pacific Design Center.
Yeah.
That's a really unusual place to find in any city. There's obviously Santa Monica Boulevard if you're into the clubs and the scene. And then you have the Formosa for dinner and drinks.
Exactly.
It kind of caps it all off, I think.
Tying it all together.
Yeah.
Well, just final thoughts as we sort of wrap. I mean, we could talk about this all day. I have to say,
You'll
it's
be
so fascinating.
Totally could,
But any sort of like final thoughts, tips, insight for those that might be tuning in? What should they take away? What is the sentiment that that you think of when you think of West Hollywood?
Well, I like I said, I think it comes down to like fun, creativity, openness.
Yeah, open-mindedness.
For sure, definitely.
We welcome all.
It has a great history of that.
Definitely.
And it welcomes all types. And I think people should just come and revel in it.
Agreed. Couldn't agree more.
Right.
Definitely. Well, this is perfect. Well, thank you so much
welcome.
for the
So great to meet
conversation
you,
today.
Bobby.
You too. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
So great. Thank you.